The MMO genre is dead. The attempts to revive it have largely failed due to gross monetization, not meeting expectations, or being completely out of touch with what MMO players actually want. Giant publishers looking at how they can quickly earn some money from the genre instead of actually making a game with the kind of longevity that will celebrate its 10th, 15th, and 20th anniversaries. But even the player base, even the MMO players don't seem to know what they want anymore. An aging base of players that are uncertain, leaving nothing but a barren wasteland of the old games we still play and the new games we don't give a shit about. The MMO genre is dead. Or is it? Is there still a savior for the MMO genre?
Help me.
Pantheon, Rise of the Fallen.
You're my only hope. Help me.
Ashes of Creation.
You're my only hope.
If you ask Eliot Lefebvre, and I apologize if I'm getting your name wrong, over at Massively OP, that answer is probably no. According to them, Kickstarter MMOs haven't saved the genre. In fact, they never really had a chance to. And honestly, can you blame Massively OP for this opinion after the recent ridiculous and downright depressing saga of Magic to Master? You know, the former game being revived through a Kickstarter that straight up lied about testimonials, the one that used fake reviews from sources like Massively OP and MMORPG.com to essentially scam people out of money for their MMO, if it actually is a game. That game, the one that makes Chronicles of Illyria seem like a legitimate product. But Eliot isn't just saying that crowdfunded MMOs haven't saved the genre. They're asking why. Why didn't crowdfund MMOs save the genre? And while they have some solid reasoning, I actually have to disagree, strongly disagree, because I believe that there is hope. I believe that our Obi-Wan is out there, though probably not on Star Wars: The Old Republic anymore. Before we get into the article, we need to talk about another piece by Massively, all the way back in August of 2021, titled Defining the Eras of MMORPG History. Now, this article is deserving of its own dissection because it's really fascinating to look at the history of MMOs. But for this video, we're looking specifically at 2015 to 2019, titled The Kickstarter Era, largely because, well, that's when indie development teams went to Kickstarter to fund their games instead of EA, Blizzard, and SOE, who were in the midst of f***ing up games with loot boxes and canceling MMORPGs before they ever launched. And no, I'm not salty at all about EverQuest Next and Project Titan never even getting to see the light of day. Certainly not salty about the fact that Landmark, a game that actually did launch, was unceremoniously closed for no damn reason. Maybe I'm a little salty. Being a fan of MMOs can be tough sometimes. In this era, Star Citizen famously set records. Pantheon: Rise of the Fallen actually failed their Kickstarter, and others like Ashes of Creation met their ambitious goals and began to get to work. This era came about for a reason. There was a vacancy to fill, hope that needed to be infused into the genre, hope of gamers. Before the Kickstarter era, there was two pretty disappointing eras of MMOs. The WoW clone era from 2004 to 2009, which saw games rush to copy WoW and ultimately release games that were hollow, unfinished reskins of Blizzard's Triumph that would perish under withering expectations. This was such a dark valley for the MMO space that its ills have reverberated for years afterward. It was a sort of gold rush for MMORPGs trying to tap into what WoW had done, which stifled innovation and destroyed worlds. Old games died like Star Wars Galaxies, or withered into maintenance mode like DAOC, and yeah, I'm gonna call it out here, EverQuest 2. New games launched and burned out, closing early like Vanguard, Warhammer Online, Runes of Magic, and Wildstar, among many, many more. From there, we slipped into the next generation, the era of Final Fantasy XIV, which originally launched as a game so damn bad, it closed and went back into development. I actually played it at launch, or at least the slideshow I was able to play, and it needed to close. Its closure and relaunch 3 years later in 2013 marked the end of the WoW clone era. as it launched along with games like Guild Wars 2, ESO, and Star Wars The Old Republic. And Star Wars The Old Republic is going to be mentioned a lot in this video, and I feel bad that it is. But it wasn't just these games that launched around this time period. You also had games like Rift and Archage, which are kind of on their last legs. This was the last flurry of big releases for the MMO genre we've really had. It was the last gasp of air for a genre that had kind of lost its way in the wake of World of Warcraft's immense success. Everything was in the shadow of World of Warcraft, trying to emulate it or slightly tweak things and just be a little bit different. The gold rush for the MMO genre was officially over. Since then, we have seen a cycle of hype and letdown, or really about a decade now. It's games that launch that don't meet expectations, games that launch with really poisonous monetization that kills the game before it even launches, or features that absolutely infuriate gamers. The creep of monetization has been steady and brutal, and this was already a genre that was pretty heavily monetized compared to other genres. If you think about it, can you imagine any game, a single player game, asking you to pay a monthly fee just to play that game?
Pre-order deluxe, head start kit. Jesus, stop, please, no more. No. Stop. No, I don't want to purchase. Stop it. Stop. No, Game Pass. Well, Game Pass is alright, maybe. I don't know. That's it? Alright. Finally, that was crazy, man. That was the worst case.
You know, I guess it's no longer just MMOs. A decade of losses for MMOs appeared to have left big developers wary of the genre. Enter the Kickstarter MMO. MMOs are a niche market, but with that smaller focus, you get passion. Passion to make an MMO that delivers on the promise to make a living, breathing world, the kind of taglines that you heard in the very beginning of the MMO genre. And it was in this time period from 2015 to 2019 where we saw the rise of these plucky independent studios that were promising that they might be able to deliver in a way that these huge studios simply weren't. Games of note that were kickstarted include Star Citizen, Albion Online, Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, Crowfall, Elite Dangerous, Adventure Quest 3D, Ashes of Creation, Camelot Unchained, Chronicles of Illyria, Legends of Aria, Embers Adrift, Temtem, Shroud of the Avatar, etc., etc., etc. Listening to that list, you may be feeling several emotions: anger, despair, frustration, or maybe even a little bit of hope. It all depends on which game you focus on. Albion Online is, by all accounts, very successful. Ashes of Creation and Pantheon have devoted fan bases. Even Star Citizen, for its seemingly endless development hell and limitless monetization, has a devoted base of both fans and haters. Then there's the obvious scams: Chronicles of Illyria and now Legends of Aria. The major disappointments, Shroud of the Avatar and Crowfall, but that's only one small slice of the overall eruption of Kickstarter MMOs that came out of this era of absolute need. Massively OP has a list of Kickstarted or indie MMOs they're watching right now, and it's over 100 games long. More have probably launched than you think, more still seem to be stuck in development purgatory, with many in persistent states of alpha or beta. Of those 100, the majority will probably end up canceled or failed, which is kind of what this article is getting at, and they look at it in a few key ways. But before we get into that, we have a word from our sponsor. It's me, I'm the sponsor. You see, I actually had an MMO sponsor lined up for this, but after really some careful consideration, didn't feel like they lined up with the values of this channel, and I wouldn't be able to be honest in the way that I wanted to be honest. So I'm sponsoring it with my book. It's listed down in the comment section down below. I've got it on sale for $2.99 until the end of this month. If you do pick it up, it really helps the channel and it really helps me. Thank you so much, and let's get back to the video that I already did of me. MMOs are expensive. It shouldn't be surprising that they're expensive, but just how expensive they are is a little bit shocking. I remember just how overwhelmed I was when I learned that Star Wars The Old Republic reportedly cost $200 million to make. To put that in perspective, while there is obviously no official figure for it, outlets like GameSutra and VentureBeat have reported costs of between $85 million to $100 million to make Skyrim. Skyrim released in November of 2011, 1 month before Star Wars The Old Republic, and at the time, it was one of the most expensive games ever made. If I were to run a poll on which of these games has been more successful, many would probably point to Skyrim, especially with Star Wars The Old Republic being shipped out from BioWare over to Broadsword as of this year. And that's even with Star Wars The Old Republic over the lifetime of its game making a reported $1 billion in revenue, as reported by their earnings report from EA. Billion with a B, and it's still shifting over to Broadsword now. Looking at this cost list from GameRant is even more elucidating. Star Wars The Old Republic sits neatly at number 2 for the most expensive games ever made, above huge hits like Red Dead Redemption 2, GTA 5, and even the more recent Cyberpunk 2077. But the number 1 game on the list? Actually, before we reveal number 1, we have to talk about a game that actually was released after this list was made: Elden Ring. Like many games, there's no official cost, but there are estimates. And with the estimates of Elden Ring, we might be able to get a better handle on what a AAA game actually costs in 2023. Estimates from a few different sites that all used a similar methodology of comparing production costs of AAA competitors, production costs from older From Software titles, advertising, and estimates of employee compensation result in a sum of around $200 million, with a range between $100 and $300 million for Elden Ring. Astronomical numbers, unofficial numbers, but astronomical still. Now let's take that one step further with more junk math that my high school math teacher would throw out the window. In 2011, Star Wars The Old Republic cost $200 million to Skyrim's $85 million. The MMO was roughly 2.35 times the cost of the biggest single-player game at the time. If in some weird universe those numbers work out to be exactly the same, and we compare Elden Ring to a hypothetical MMO created in the same year, a high-budget MMO in 2023 would be 2.3 times more than the cost of Elden Ring's $200 million, leaving us at roughly $470 million for a triple-budget MMO. Now, like I said, that is all a bunch of junk math, but it is an important number when we move on to our most expensive game ever made, or at least in the process of being made. Star Citizen. And this list is from 2022. Star Citizen themselves have a tracker to show how much funding they've raised, and as of June of 2023, the game has raised an astronomical $590 million from 4.6 million backers. The game is the albatross of the Kickstarter MMO genre. It's the game that people will always point to as all the sins of the Kickstarter MMO, a game with impossibly large coffers and similarly impossibly large ambition, which we'll get to in a moment. A game that hasn't fully released, but is functional in its alpha state and continues to sell packages. Full disclosure, I actually purchased one of those packages very recently to review the game for about $45 on sale. And then I quickly realized that my shitty PC could not actually run the game. Star Citizen may be what Eliot is referring to in their article as the unofficial business model of these crowdfunded games. Sell the cool idea, not the final product. But Star Citizen is not indicative of the Kickstarted MMO. Most don't sniff anywhere near the amount of money one might expect an MMO to cost, and therein lies part of the problem. Pantheon: Rise of the Fallen's original Kickstarter goal was a mere $800,000, which is a huge sum for you and I, but nothing for an MMO. And it failed. Of the $800,000 goal, it made just over $460,000. Pantheon, of course, would go on to be crowdfunded through their website instead of going through a site like Kickstarter, and they're in continued development for a variety of reasons with additional income coming in, and we'll talk about that in just a sec. As of Creation, which is one of the largest Kickstarter MMOs in development, well, their initial Kickstarter in 2017 made a huge $3.2 million. Again, a huge number for us, but nothing in comparison to what it seems the cost of an MMO is. It is a mere 1.6% of the budget for an MMO that launched in 2011. For Albion Online, which didn't actually use Kickstarter but instead relied on crowdfunding through founders packs, only had about 35,000 founders, which brought in about $2.5 million. All of these examples show one thing: Kickstarted MMOs are working with tiny budgets in comparison to even AAA single-player games. Many games in development right now have relied on exterior investment. City State Entertainment, who are making Camelot Unchained, in 2022 secured an additional $15 million in funding from their latest round of minority investors. Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, the game that had failed their Kickstarter, announced last year that they had secured $2.4 million in private investments. With this massive budget shortfall between the Kickstarted MMO and an MMO like Star Wars The Old Republic, it makes more sense why some of these games are still in development, or why they get cancelled. They are trying to move mountains with shovels. So in this point, I actually kind of agree with the article. MMOs are incredibly expensive, and Kickstarter MMOs are kind of going at it at a huge disadvantage. It doesn't matter how much money we're putting into the games, because unless you're Star Citizen, you're probably looking at a huge deficit compared to what other MMOs are facing, what other MMOs have been able to do over the last couple decades. Even if you go all the way back to World of Warcraft in 2004, 20 years ago, and yes, I know that makes you feel old because it makes me feel old too. Well, they reportedly made that game for about 63 or $64 million. There's only one Kickstarter MMO we've talked about that has surpassed that number, and that's Star Citizen. So believing in these Kickstarter games either requires a lot more patience than we were originally planning on, or a suspension of disbelief that somehow these teams, these much smaller teams with much smaller coffers, are going to be able to do the impossible. But while I agree with this point to an extent with the article, let's get to my major disagreement with them. A lot of crowdfunded projects promise to finally bring innovation to the MMO space and bring back the classic feeling of old school MMOs. This is impossible. I don't mean that these two premises are necessarily undesirable, but these two positions are inherently contradictory. They cannot both be true at the same time. This is where I have to respectfully disagree, because while it may seem like these seemingly contradictory statements can't work together, I think they actually can work in very good concert together. Ashes of Creation, for example, is looking at the classic hardcore PvP experience, but they're trying to innovate on it with different systems to discourage certain PvP behaviors, like ganking while encouraging others. They're using nodes which aren't too dissimilar from player cities in Shadowbane, but they're innovating on how these present themselves in the world, not just for PvP, but also in PvE, creating interesting stories based off of the way that you advance the node, creating a new world that is innovating off of old design. Pantheon Rise of the Fallen is looking to games like EverQuest for its class roles, but doing so with limited action sets more akin to a game like Guild Wars 2 or Elder Scrolls Online. They're bringing in climbing like EverQuest 2, but innovating on how it presents and how it helps you interact with the world in unique ways, making it a major function of how the game works, making it so that the world itself feels more alive than the games that it's inspired by. And these are small parts of it. There is much more innovation in each of these games and much more innovation in many other Kickstarter MMOs. I look at this argument the same way someone might say that Guild Wars 2 or ESO weren't an innovation in the MMO genre, because they both rely heavily on questing and gearing and things like that. And yes, Guild Wars 2 has a lot of horizontal advancement, but they're still at the basis games that took the formula that WoW had perfected and applied it, using instance dungeons, using questing to make you go forward, and a lot of single player story. And they're both class-based games, which is ironic because in the article, Guild Wars 2 is actually pointed out as being an innovative game. This to me is really the weakest part of the article, really the only weak part of the article. Because what makes Guild Wars 2 so different from Ashes of Creation in terms of innovation? Innovation to me isn't about throwing out everything that came before. It's not about getting rid of the things that worked. It's about taking the basis of the game that was there before and making it better in different ways, doing things that that game has not done, with the things that it did well. But I do have to defend this article in the same breath, because there are a lot of games that are actually not innovating at all. A prime example of that is one that I backed called Legends of Aria. Legends of Aria was essentially just a graphical reskin of Ultima Online. There was nothing really innovative about that game, and when it did finally launch, it kind of struggled mightily, only to be sold off and then turned into now a crypto NFT game, which is not the kind of innovation that many of us want. So while there are projects that fit this argument made in the article, I don't think that's how the Kickstarter MMO is looking. The Kickstarter MMO is innovating in plenty of ways. Just because they are classically inspired in many ways does not mean that they are not an innovative genre. The final point in this article is about ambition, and that word makes me think of two main projects: Ashes of Creation and Star Citizen. Both of these games have captured the largest audience, positive and negative, and there's a reason for that, as Eliot says in this article. Cool ideas don't always work. The problem is that crowdfunding does not care. Crowdfunding is a platform where you can ask people to give you money to make a cool idea happen. We assume, because of basic human nature, that before we ask for money, smart people have figured out if the cool idea is actually going to work, or if it's even a good idea. But that's not actually a requirement. But this isn't related to just crowdfunding. It's a good reminder for anyone who's considering backing any project. And backing a project doesn't just mean crowdfunding. When you pre-order a game, you are essentially doing the same thing. When you buy into an early access game on Steam, you are doing a similar thing. It's something for people to remember when looking at games like Redfall and Gollum and Throne and Liberty, games that are not at all crowdfunded. Crowdfunded MMOs haven't cornered the market on disappointment. There's plenty of that to go around in the gaming space, including from AAA publishers or independent publishers. There is a widespread issue with games in general often not meeting expectations, so I think it's a little bit harsh to put it just on the Kickstarter MMOs. However, the point is still well made in this article if you were to single out a single Kickstarter MMO. Star Citizen. It is an incomplete game that continues to encourage investment based on ideas that may or may not be possible. While some crowdfunded MMOs can point to small teams and funding for their lengthy development time, Star Citizen is one of those games that has kind of run out of excuses, with a budget larger than most of, not all, AAA studios, so I can see why people get so frustrated and disheartened. Until it launches or closes, it is the headline of the Kickstarter era. It is one of the first, and it is by far the largest and most ambitious. The last stretch goal on Robert Industries' website was at 65 million raised, so we're pretty damn far from the backers paying into new features for the game. Other Kickstarted MMOs with a fraction of their budget have launched. Some are still going, like Albion Online and Embers Adrift. Others closed, like Crowfall. but they at least delivered what they had promised to the best of their ability. Star Citizen is a game that many people enjoy today. It has a bustling community on Twitch and actually looks like it could be fun when it works, but it still bears the alpha tag. Players are right to be frustrated with Star Citizen, but it is truly an anomaly in the crowdfunding space and in my opinion should be viewed somewhat separately. And that brings us to my final thoughts, my hope, my defense of this sort of subgenre. In the absence of light, there is only darkness. And for MMO players, that means that for us, for the next decade or so, if we're only looking at the games that are announced coming out from other studios that are not independent, we're looking at a decade of games only being produced by the likes of NCSoft and Amazon Game Studios. And for many players, and myself included in that, that's very dark. So much so that the fans of traditionally published MMOs have been clinging to the Riot MMO, despite precious few details and no guarantees it will ever actually be a game since it was somewhat clumsily announced unofficially on Twitter. The Riot MMO is a good example of how even without crowdfunding, the genre is so desperate for a game, we will apply the cool idea philosophy. There are countless videos here on YouTube talking about potential lore, including races and classes and other hypotheticals for the Riot MMO, and none of them have been announced by any Riot sources. We just want a good MMO. We don't really care whether it is an independent studio or a big studio. And in each way, there is widespread distrust, and many times for good reason. It's not like Blizzard and NCSoft exactly have the trust of players at this point. For the same token, many crowdfunded MMOs have also let down players. But if you're like me and you love the genre, there is a hope in this for these games to succeed. A hope that all of them will in some way succeed, because these games are going to be hitting at different things for different players. A game like Monsters and Memories is going to be the completely classically inspired game for players that really want that. A game like Embers Adrift is a game that's out right now and is appealing to the hardcore PvE fans. A game like Star Citizen, if it does launch, and I do hope it does, promises to provide a new world for people that is beyond expectation. I look to games like Pantheon Rise of the Fallen and Ashes of Creation as potential change for the genre. If these two games both fail, that could spell doom for the genre, or at least its independent arm. These games have captured the hearts and minds of many MMO players over the last few years, and if they end up like a Crowfall or Legends of Aria, then perhaps it will show that the MMOs really are too expensive and too ambitious to be made independently. And that day for me would be a very sad day. A day when the only things we have left in this genre are to look at companies that for over a decade have been testing the boundaries of what they could get us to pay for. What different types of monetization can they squeeze out of players? What different ways can they encourage you to log in every single day? Not because the game itself is good and fun, but because you have to check off things on your list like daily quests. I can envision a future where the games like Star Citizen, Ashes of Creation, and Pantheon all fail. But I can also envision a future where these games succeed and join the successes of some crowdfunded games like Albion Online. But that's just my opinion, and if you stuck around to the end of this video, thank you so much. This is perhaps one of the longest videos I've ever made on this channel, but it's one that I felt very passionate about. And I really appreciate you sticking around to the end. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Redbeard Flint, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope that the MMO genre looks better in 5 years.